taken. It was a splitting of the bills with the decision to make them, of course, contingent upon the passage of each.
All right. Then, just to be sure, I'm looking at the Assembly Committee on Education's analysis of SB 4, and it indicates as amended January 5th, 2010. I believe that that is an error. The most recent version of the bill that I have that bears your name on SB 4 says amended in Assembly January 4th. I'm just trying to be sure, Senator, that I have the absolute latest, up-to-the-minute, accurate version of the bill, and given the fact that it is described as amended January the 5th, and I'm sharing the committee's analysis with your staff, that I have the right copy of the bill. I'm pretty sure I do. I just want to make sure.
Madam Chair, that you're correct. And yesterday, the chairwoman of Assembly Education at the outset of the hearing noted that they had the incorrect amendment date on the analysis.
Thank you. That's helpful. That being said, we were handed yesterday copies of Senate Bill 1, as amended in the Assembly January the 4th, and I understand now that actually the current version and the version before the committee is the version as amended in Assembly January the 5th. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Great. Then when we get to the conversation about Assembly Bill number 1, I will be asking questions about what those...
Just correction, there is no Assembly Bill 1. There's a Senate
Bill 1. I will be asking about what those amendments entail. Then, with respect to this bill, Senate Bill 4, here are some questions. There was, and whether you, Senator Huff, or your fellow author, Senator Romero, would like to respond, I leave to you, of course. The issue was raised in the testimony, and I note that it was raised in the Assembly discussion as well, so I'm guessing you've had a chance to respond to this, that the bill excludes charter schools from the list of schools identified by the SPI to participate in the open enrollment program. Of the 945 schools ranked in decile 1 based on the API in 2008-9, there are 103 charter schools. This means that 103 of California's lowest achieving charter schools will be excluded from the open enrollment program, and an equal number of higher achieving traditional public schools will be required to participate in this program. Is that an accurate observation in the Assembly's analysis? And if so, could someone share the thinking for excluding those charter schools from participating in the open enrollment program?
It's accurate. In the ballpark, it changes from year to year in terms of the numbers that are the lowest performing. It was a result of negotiations and compromise as to the nature of the schools that would be excluded. And the excluded categories were not just charter schools. They were juvenile court schools, county, community schools, and charter schools. And the reasons for those is for the two first categories were categories of schools that in many cases are not voluntary assignments because of judicial or other administrative action relating to disciplinary or probationary issues. With respect to charter schools, since enrollment in charter schools is optional on the part of the parent and not a mandatory assignment, they are already essentially an open enrollment school, and to the extent that they are a low-performing school, they already are required under ESEA to have the parent notification requirement to notify them that they are a parent of a child assigned to a low-performing school, and that they have the option to transfer, and it's a redundant option to transfer in the sense that that parent is choosing in the first instance to go to the charter school. If the school to which the parent would otherwise be assigned is one of the low-performing schools, that would still permit that parent to have the option to disenroll from the charter school, be assigned to that other low-performing school, if that were to be the case, and take advantage of the open enrollment opportunity either under ESEA to intra-district transfer or now in the combination of ESEA and this proposed measure to have an inter-district transfer opportunity.
And could I ask either the authors or the witness through the chair, why was that answer not acceptable to people? That obviously was still a source of concern, and I'm curious. I mean, as I hear, the short version on your argument is, hey, look, the whole point of open enrollment is to let kids out of a place that's not serving them well. If it's a voluntary opportunity for them to go to a charter school, same need does not exist. There's a certain logic to that. So why didn't that assuage the concerns? What's the counter argument? Or perhaps we can ask.
I never understood the why myself.
To be dispassionate about it, I think to try and be fair, there were two issues. One is there were people that wanted charter, that in this whole package of legislation want a higher level of accountability on charter schools, and if the argument is that that notifying the parents and alerting them and giving them opportunities is something that should apply to everybody, then charter schools should be included in the application of that. They're also, quite candidly, and this is part of the sausage-making process, but quite candidly, it had to do with a question of in some of the multi-party stakeholder concerns here is the footprint of the open enrollment program. And to the extent that you could incorporate charter schools into the footprint of the open enrollment program, even though they already are open enrollment schools, you would otherwise be reducing the scope of the footprint of non-open enrollment traditional type schools that would be affected by any change in the expansion of the concept of open enrollment. So for some, the reason is accountability. For others, the reason was stated that it would lower the number of traditional non-open enrollment schools that would otherwise be subject to these provisions.
Through the chair, I see that one of the witnesses has come back. I'd appreciate hearing why the reaction that we got wasn't satisfactory to opponents.
Erica Hoffman with the California School Boards Association. This was an issue that I had raised in yesterday's committee hearing. It was an issue that was raised in today's hearing. One of the concerns we have is these are low-performing schools. Charter or not, they're low-performing schools. To exempt them and to have the parent have the ability under the open enrollment provisions to then move that child, let's say, out of the district to another district, which open enrollment does allow, they would actually now have to go back to their school of enrollment. If it's a Title I school that qualifies under the open enrollment provisions, that child would have to be at that school for a year, and then they could transfer out again. So basically, one of the biggest concerns CSBA has is that you're bouncing the child around. If it's a low-performing school, our issue is, shouldn't they then just be allowed, as with any other low-performing school that's a Title I school that qualifies under the open enrollment provision, to then be able to transfer that child the following year just like you could in a regular school?
So if my
Senator Simitian, if I can just say overall, I'm looking at this, and there may not be a resolution on it. At the end of the day, we're here on concurrence. As we looked at this, this is about parental choice in public education. By definition, a charter school is a choice. The same way as well, too, we excluded comparably juvenile court schools. And that's because it's not based on zip code. It's not the neighborhood school. It's based on a behavioral issue. The same way as well, this is part of the debate we had in the Assembly, community day schools, of which there are approximately 400, I think over 400. Once we limited the universe of schools to 1,000, that's where these issues began in terms of the exclusion. The intent of the legislation was to really focus on the neighborhood school to which, by zip code, one was assigned. In fact, in the Assembly, we actually had a conversation about if we did the base 1,000, perhaps we went over that and included an additional universe of schools that dealt with the community day schools and possibly the charters. That issue was decided in the Assembly. We didn't want to go there. So in looking at truly to get to the intent of open enrollment, dealing with the issue of geography, we decided to say let's exclude these other category of schools so that we can focus purely on the concept of by zip code, this is where you automatically are assigned.
Thank you. If I could finish my question to the witness, Madam Chair. Thank you.
But members, I am going to say as well, too, that I am going to indicate we've gotten a note here that at a certain point we are going to perhaps lose some members from the Senate floor today. I just want us to be cognizant of that issue.
Madam Chair, I know you want to make sure we have a full and fair discussion, and I look forward to having that full and fair discussion. We've previously dealt with bills which were works in progress. Last time we had the bill delivered to us as we sat down with no analysis. We voted the bill out as a work in progress. That was a demonstration of good faith, I think, on the part of committee members for the work that you and Senator Huff have done. But that was done with the assurance that we would have the opportunity when the bill came back to have a very thorough hearing here today. So my hope and expectation is that that very thorough hearing will be accommodated as previously guaranteed. So back to the question. If I understand the witness correctly, your rebuttal argument is, yes, it's true, they chose this charter school, but if they were originally in a traditional school that did not serve them well, had the misfortune of choosing a charter school which also does not serve them well, and now want to get out and get to one of these higher performing schools, your argument is that they should not have to go back to the original school which did not serve them well, spend a year there, and basically tread water, try and stay afloat for a year before they have the opportunity to go to a higher performing school which any other kid would have the right to ask for. Am I making your argument well?
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Okay. All right. I now understand what the debate is. Thank you for that. In terms of the finances, I understand now what the amendments do with respect to revenue limit with respect to basic aid districts, but I wanted to revisit, now that we have the final language, how we're handling the revenue limit finances for traditional revenue limit districts. Assuming a youngster who participates in the open enrollment program goes from a revenue limit district to another revenue limit district as part of the open enrollment program that's here, what are the finances? Help me follow the finances here.
Senator, under current law, the districts would enter into an agreement to basically shift the revenue limit money so that only one district would receive the money for the student. They are, though, in fact, entitled to declining enrollment as well, depending on how many students actually left and if they end up in decline, because they, too, may be receiving other students.
So let's try it this way. If there were 100 students here, and there were 100 students here, and one of these kids leaves to go to the other school, but this first school ends up getting 2 more kids just through natural enrollment, and they're at 101,
Right.
They obviously are not going to receive declining enrollment money.
Correct.
Are they going to receive the revenue limit for the departing kid for that first year under this arrangement?
They would only receive funding for that student based on the time of attendance that they had in that school, and then the other district would claim the rest of that time.
So if you are not a declining enrollment district, then you do not receive revenue limit funds to, quote, hold you harmless for the loss of the kid.
Correct.
Okay. And so when we talk about that hold harmless notion or providing the revenue limit funding for a district that is sending a youngster, that's only in the context of net, them turning out to be a declining enrollment.
They do, in fact, though, under the way the categorical reform was structured, they will keep the categorical funding that was in the block grant for the next 5 years, whether or not the students are there to claim the higher amounts.
Great. The discussion was raised today in passing by one of the witnesses. The conversation, did you want to rethink the last answer, or are we good on that? Okay. The discussion was raised by today's witnesses, and it was called out at some length in the assembly analysis on the bill about the use of Title I funds to pay for transportation. You will recall I asked about this at the December 17th hearing. Could we walk through this one more time? And please remember, I said at the last hearing, the fact that we can't serve everyone is not a reason we should serve no one. So I'm not making that argument. I'm getting questions from my district, though, and I myself have questions about, so how does this really work in terms of giving a kid a real opportunity to get from where he is to where he wants to and presumably should be? So if back to our little district with 100 kids, if one of them says, you know what, I want to go over there and I need transportation, how does his or her parent make that work? What do they do?
So technically, the district, under current federal law, is required, if they're in a PI, and most of these schools are going to be at least PI1. If they're in PI1, the district is supposed to provide the equivalent of 20% of their Title I dollars, and those dollars must be used for either remediating the student or allowing them to transfer within the district. If they are in PI5, then the student can also transfer into another district, not within the district, but another district, which I think that was part of the controversy, whether or not the initial enrolling district actually paid for that cost. Title I is based on a census, so as long as that student continues to reside in that district's area, the district will not lose the money. They continue to receive the Title I dollars, even though the student is now enrolled in another district, let's say, under that example.
And I think part of the debate was about whether or not then the sending district would in effect be paying for the transportation of the student who now attends school in the district of enrollment.
Correct, and that is correct, because they do not lose the Title I dollars that student generates.
And then, so the expectation is, to be very practical and sort of nitty-gritty about this, that if Susie or Sally or Johnny gets on the bus, that the sending district will cut a check to cover that cost and send it off to the receiving district. Is that, or
potentially they could provide the bus passes to the student. I think it just depends on where you're located. And you know, we could say if they're spending $1,000 now for remediation, the cost of a pass, depending on where you are, should be far less.
Great. Then thank you. We're now looking at 1,000 schools, as I understand it. And I believe that was a significant rollback from earlier versions of the bill. 1,000 out of how many do we estimate now statewide? How many schools?
Over 9,000 schools statewide.
So we're in about the bottom 10%, more or less. Okay. And I don't want to make your argument for you, but the number of schools in parental empowerment is now down to 75. Is that right?
Correct.
That's an awfully small number out of 9 to 10,000 schools. Why do you think we're getting so much pushback when it's such a small number? I mean, if I were Senator Romero and I were making her argument for her, something I have learned not to do.
You're actually on a good roll. I like this part.
So, then I'd say, for God's sakes, we're talking about less than 1% of the schools in the state. We're talking about the schools that are the least successful in the judgment of their own communities. Why is that a problem? And what's the pushback on that? And if there are witnesses who want to talk, I'd be pleased to hear them, because I think it's an important issue.
Andrew Governor, on behalf of Green Dot Public Schools and Parent Revolution, and I have Shirley Ford with me. And Shirley, one here. Oh, thank you. I think we can address that. I think, of course, and we said this in our assembly testimony, we would have loved to have seen a larger segment of the schools included, but we believe 75 is a good starting point, and I'd like Shirley to address, I think, what she's seen on the ground. I think for her, what do you think of the 75 school cap?
I think that we would have loved for it to have been more, considering as many failing schools as we have, but I believe that 75 is a good starting point, and we're grateful to get that number. We're grateful to even get the bill in. It's a starting point. It's a beginning of a new way of thinking and having parents as partners.
And we believe the proof will be in the pudding, so to speak, that after a number of years, we believe that parents becoming involved and exercising choice will prove to be a good thing, and that the legislature will look back on this and be proud of what they've done today. So thank you.
There is an interesting issue here that I think is a tough call, which is goes to the center of parental empowerment, which is that the schools, of course, do not belong to any one group of parents at any one group at any one time. I mean, the reason we have compulsory education is because we believe that education accrues to the benefit of the entire state, and that when we fail the kids we're talking about, we fail the entire state, not just those kids individually. On the other hand, we do have an obligation to each one of those kids individually, and if the parents aren't going to be able to speak up for them, I don't know who will. So, do you have any thoughts about, the reason we let everybody vote in a school board election is because the whole city or community is, we hope, concerned about the effectiveness of their schools, and yet in this case we've put this power in the hands of one group of parents at one particular time. Thoughts about that?
Yes, sir. What comes to mind when you were asking that question is the fact that, and I'm not here to bash any one entity of anything, is that if a group of teachers get together, 50% plus one of teachers can do the same thing, that we will only be collecting petitions and coming together collectively, going through a process, and some of the process is already in place there. So as a parent and a grandparent, now that's what come to mind to me, that yes, we are making decisions for the incoming parents that are coming to the school, but I would have loved for someone ahead of me to have made the schools in my neighborhood better, so I didn't have to falsify addresses. I didn't have to go running all over the city. I didn't have to be afraid of high school, middle school, and high school for my two boys.
Thanks. Madam Chair, that's all the questions I have. I do have a comment I'd like to offer at this point, which is I have been struck throughout this debate by how passionate, some might even say strident, both supporters and opponents have been. And I think that's probably understanding. I'm not sure it has served the debate particularly well. I would have to describe my own take on all of this as stridently ambivalent. And pretty much that's where I've been from the start. I think you can, on the one hand, on the other hand, this conversation all day long. On the one hand, should we be scrambling in the space of 60 days over the course of both the Thanksgiving holiday and the winter holiday to rewrite California education law for an undetermined but assuredly modest amount of money, which may or may not come to California? On the other hand, $500 or $600 billion is not a small amount. The administration has indicated that this is criteria that's likely to apply to future federal funding. And frankly, what's really going on here is an effort by the Obama administration to create some sense of urgency around conditions that have lasted far too long. So it's on the one hand, on the other hand. On the one hand, we'd like to make sure that kids who are being failed by the system get served. On the other hand, we'd like to make sure that the way we do that doesn't turn the world upside down for other kids who are being well served in their schools and in their districts. And that is something that I think people have expressed understandable concern about. On the one hand, we're working on a deadline, and on the other hand, the consequences will be long-lasting. And I think we need to be mindful of that. And, I guess the last observation I will make is that, and this is not a criticism of either House or of any of the authors, but the fact that we have sort of been looking at sort of works in progress and that we couldn't sort of have both more time and a more routine process through which to work these conversations through I think has not served us well. It's just been a struggle in terms of doing good work and getting inside the meat of the legislation. So, as I said, I know people have strongly held views, and what I am is largely ambivalent based on the discussions that we've had to date. And I appreciate the chair's willingness to make time for my questions. Thank you.
Any other comments from the committee? Senator Weiland.
Just briefly, I hope, Senator, submitting your ambivalence does translate into an aye vote today. Look, this is far more modest, I believe, than it has been portrayed to be. And I absolutely believe that any wrinkles will work out. This should be a model, and I think would serve as a model to improve all public schools. And my experience is that virtually all parents want their children to go to a reasonably good public school. The very notion of charters when they first started was that they were just experiments that districts would copy. They'd say, well, this is working, this isn't working. And instead, what's been started is this huge competition between them. So I just think this is something we really ought to support. Let's see if something works and the district can copy it. There's no magic here. This is just a nice, good start. And if we can help kids in any way, every one of those things can be copied by every one of these schools, and we can keep every one of these kids in those schools. And frankly, there's not going to be a mass exodus. It's just not going to happen in reality. So I think this is a really worthy first step that has been I don't want to say watered down, that has been reduced in its scope so that it's just a very worthy experiment that will not change the world. Let's support it and see if we can learn something from it. I think it's a good bill.
Thank you. Senator Huff, I'd like to just make a couple of comments before we allow you to close. There's a reason when President Obama spoke on this issue, he called upon the nation to take drastic steps when our schools are failing. Secretary Duncan articulated this is the toughest assignment. We share many of the concerns. I look at this and I think to a large extent we in this building have been responsible for the creation of those concerns because for too long we have simply looked the other way when it comes to dealing with our state's lowest performing schools year after year. We had a parent testify 12 years. I didn't bring my scroll to committee. At least 7 years, some of these schools, 10 years, 12 years. We heard the governor speak today about the cost of incarceration versus education. This piece of legislation, to some extent, its boldness is its simplicity. It simply says, do it. We want not effort, we want results. And starting with parents, the most old-fashioned piece of democracy, a petition to say, we the people will initiate the reforms if you do not do it yourself. I think it is a bold move. I look forward to partnering with parents. I look forward to us forcing us in California to open up what we see and look at the lowest performing schools and witness the belief and hope and dreams of parents to give their children an opportunity. You've often heard me say my mother had a 6th grade education. I'm one of those kids from the other side of the tracks, and I'm sitting here today as the chair of Senate Education. It is but for the intervention of my mother on my behalf that I believe I am here today. Senator Huff, it's been a real honor to work with you and so many others. These have been very spirited and passionate debates, and I understand the concern of the opposition, and I respect the voices and the concerns of that opposition. but it is time to move forward. I want to thank the Speaker of the House, Speaker Bass, her team, the members who came forward, good conversations throughout the many months, because this began back in August. And Senator Huff, I'd like to turn it back to you for a close, and hopefully we can move forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair and members. You know, Senator Simitian, through your methodical inquiries, you have answered the questions that I had highlighted out here to hit, so I appreciate that. In your ambivalence, I do hope that you will err on the side of the parents and the students that have been trapped in a failing educational system. I'm often reminded that we shouldn't let the perfect get in the way of the good, and that's the situation we have here. We will never have a perfect bill, and that's why we come back and we address things, and sometimes we address them the way I like them, sometimes we address them the way I don't like them, but we all represent different districts, we all have different life experiences, we have different constituents bringing needs to us. I'm confident that if there are inadequacies in this, we will address them and we will make it better. This hasn't been a rushed process, as one testimony said, although it may feel rushed. From our perspective, it's been very painful and long and grinding. However, it's been since August since we started this process to find a way to make our schools competitive, to turn around the lowest decile schools. And we believe the product before you will do that. It's not as much as the authors want. We wanted a lot more. And frankly, even that first version that was codified was not as much as we would want. We tried to tailor to what we believed we could get through that would make us minimally competitive. We believe this is not just minimally competitive, but it will actually help us to be competitive in the race of the top funds. And while $700 million is not enough, not a whole lot in a state with an $80 billion budget, in these constrained times, it's huge. Because I guarantee you, when we cut $50 million, $100 million, $200 million, we will hear from our constituents on that. More importantly, as I look in this room, our historic room, we have some panels up here that are over 50 years old that depict a sterling state of California. In things, as you look at that, it wells you up with pride about this state. Is our next panel going to be one with a diploma in golden rays of sunshine, or is it going to be one of crumbling schools and failed education? We have the power to continue to paint a positive history for the state of California, and I would ask for your aye vote.
Senator Huff, I move the bill. Secretary, call the roll.
Romero?
Aye.
Romero, aye. Huff?
Aye.
Huff, aye. Alquist? Hancock? Lou? Lou, no. Maldonado?
Aye.
Maldonado, aye. Padilla? Simitian? And Wyland?
Aye.
It's 4-0. It needs one more vote. Do we have a motion? Do we have a vote on it? Otherwise, I close the roll and we turn our backs on $700 million. Call the absent members.
Alquist? Hancock? Those are the two absent ones. The other ones that were abstaining.
Padilla.
Padilla, aye.
Okay.
Simitian, aye. 6-0. I mean
6-0. 6-1.
Sorry.
The bill is out. And let me state for the record, Senator Alquist is at home with pneumonia. She was prepared to come into committee to cast a vote for the children of California if need be. And I want to give gracious thanks to Senator Alquist for her willingness to do that. She is still on standby to possibly come to the floor. But is that spirit, and Senator Alquist, a teacher, a mother, a yaya, right? I want to extend my greatest thanks for Senator Alquist, who from the very beginning never wavered in her commitment to putting children and parents first. 6-1, that measure is out.
Thank you.
Senator Huff, if you would preside, and the pro tem of the Senate asked if I would present SB 1.
Please go ahead.
All right, this is Senate Bill 1. I refer to this somewhat as the one that I gave up for adoption, and Senator Steinberg took it over, and it's in great hands. He, as you know, is absorbed with State of the State issues today and has asked if I would present this measure on his behalf. And of course, I continue to stand by as continuing to be a principal co-author on this measure, proudly to present this measure as well. And so we know that, again, on December 17th, the committee approved at that time Senate Bill 4, legislation to move us forward. You've already heard the litany. The bills were split in two. Each bill, of course, contains the contingent enactment. Yesterday, of course, you know, the Assembly approved both bills. Today, we asked the committee to once again concur in the Assembly amendments. And these were negotiations, discussions, as you've heard in the previous discussion of the bill, that went over weeks and long nights in the discussion. We have come forward in this consensus. What does this bill do? Senate Bill 1 enacts statutory changes that will enable California to submit a more competitive application for federal Race to the Top incentive grants. We believe that the two bills combined represent a tremendous amount of work between the two houses and the administration, with the common goal of not only making California eligible for possibly $700 million, but also putting a template for reform, a vision for education reform in California. And it does, make no doubt about it, set the stage for what will be coming down the road as we go forward. I believe it is a mistake to simply think about it as one-time money. This is about a template for what we can anticipate for the demands and the expectations, the challenges for bold changes in public education as we continue with the Obama administration. What this bill does in terms of the Race to the Top application is it authorizes the Superintendent of Public Instruction and the State Board of Education to enter into agreements with local school districts that wish to participate in Race to the Top. As of a few days ago, I did read that about 800 districts have indicated an interest in participating. Just yesterday, Los Angeles Unified School District did finalize their MOU. That signifies a great deal of interest. This bill requires the superintendent and the state board and the governor to collaborate on a plan to submit as part of our Race to the Top application. And let me just remind members as well, I know you know this, but just to do a reminder, we in this legislation, we are not writing the plan. Okay, our bills are not about the writing of the plan. The plan is separate, but we are enabling, authorizing legislation to facilitate and to make us competitive. This has a focus, of course, on lowest achieving schools, and there's a reason for that. President Obama has specifically highlighted the need for us to take on the toughest assignment, the chronically lowest performing schools in California. This bill, of course, we talk about intervening in persistently low-performing schools. It identifies for significant intervention the bottom 5% of all Title I schools in federal program improvement, plus all high schools with graduation rates below 60% in each of the past 3 years. It also includes lowest performing secondary schools that are eligible but do not receive Title I funds. The bill also provides discretion to the superintendent and the State Board of Education to exclude those schools that do not qualify, such as juvenile court schools, special education schools, county community schools, etc. The amendments, there actually are no longer amendments, but in terms of looking at language was clarified in terms of the definition of the lowest performing schools. When we get witnesses here, they can go ahead and speak to this issue as well. On standards and assessments, this bill strengthens academic standards and assessments. It establishes an academic content standards commission appointed by the governor, assembly, and the Senate to develop and math that build toward college and career readiness by the time of high school graduation. 85% of these standards shall be Common Core academic standards as required by Race to the Top. The bill states the intent to transition to assessments that are valid, reliable, fair, and aligned to standards, and that measure student growth over time consistent with Race to the Top guidelines. With respect to teachers and principals, we believe it strengthens teachers and principals. It affirms that California students and teacher data systems may be used by local districts subject to collective bargaining to evaluate teachers and principals. It emphasizes science, technology, engineering, and math, and college and career readiness. It creates new and exciting credential pathways for aspiring STEM and CTE, career technical education teachers. It directs the superintendent to recommend ways to emphasize STEM, career and college readiness in the school accountability system. With respect to data system, it strengthens our data systems. It allows California to link workforce data to our systems of K through 12 and higher ed to better assess the impact of education on employment and earnings of former students in those systems. With that, I would respectfully ask for an aye vote to concur in the Assembly amendments.
Thank you. Witnesses in favor?
Mr. Chairman, Bill Lucia from EdVoice. I just wanted to point out a couple things that we strongly support in terms of improvements of the process over the last several weeks. This bill maintains the Senate's actions, as you've seen before, on adopting a public open process with the Standards Commission and looking and reviewing the Common Core standards and folding those into California standards. We do recognize that there's intent language that they meet the California standards. We would have preferred to see that stronger, but we understand it is the way it is, and we much prefer a public process than a sequestered one, investing all the authority in one individual. So for that reason, we believe it's improved in that matter, as well as we strongly endorse the notion of the science, technology, engineering, and math component, making the state definitely more competitive with the alternative certification and the career technical educator opportunity here to really operationalize the goals and the rhetoric about doing what we want to do in terms of incorporating career technical education into accountability systems, but actually also making sure those educators are in the classroom that can do the job.
Catherine Gaither, Governor's Office of Education. Our office does not have an official position on the bill. I would note that as a legislative package, the governor originally wanted broader and more inclusive reforms, but we would like to note that this package jointly, both bills together, put us in an excellent position to be competitive in Race to the Top.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members. Edgar Sassueta, Los Angeles Unified School District. Like SB 4, we have no official position on this bill, but I would note that our board and superintendent have very enthusiastically embraced Race to the Top. As Senator Romero stated, we signed on to the MOU just yesterday, and we see this as another tool to continue the reforms that have already been started in Los Angeles. 2 points to keep in mind in the implementation of this plan. We brought this issue up in the Assembly. I thought it was fair to bring it up here. In the spirit of Senator Romero's original bill, we want to make sure that we focus on the schools with the biggest need. A part of the language excludes schools that have achieved a 50-point increase in API over the last 5 years. We just want to make sure that, and there is some discretion for the SPI and the state board to include those schools back in. We just want to make sure that districts have a say in which schools have the biggest need. For example, Fremont High School, which has got a lot of publicity over the last couple of weeks in Los Angeles, we're reconstituting that school completely. Under the current formula, that school would be excluded. Although we have seen a 50-point increase, we started at such a low API that we want, if we're going to do this work, we want to make sure we concentrate on the schools that have the biggest need. So we've made the author's office aware of this issue. We brought this issue to the governor's office, so we just wanted to highlight that in implementation. And then lastly, over the last couple of days, there's been a lot of talk about funding and, whether all schools would get funding. And we understand that we want to get as many schools to sign on to this program. But our superintendent really believes and wanted me to express that just make an effort, a concerted effort to concentrate as many funds as possible to those, once again, to those schools with the biggest need, those Title I schools, those lowest achieving schools. But with that said, we appreciate all the work, and we continue to be partners as it moves forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Next witness.
Good morning. Nancy Lacoste, and I'm representing Long Beach Unified School District and Clovis Unified School District. And we've been in strong support. We continue to be in strong support, and we can't wait to get started. So thank you for all your hard work.
Appreciate it.
Debbie Luck with California PTA. We have not taken an official position on the bill, but certainly have been very supportive of the entire competitive race to the top application, very much in favor of the reform areas that have been presented, particularly like the language that's been included in SB1 around the turnaround strategies and the importance of involving parents in the community in a concerted effort, because we believe that that's the only way that the turnaround will be successful. So appreciate the efforts in this bill and look forward to a competitive application for California.
Thank you. Next witness.
Good morning. Bill Ring, Director of Transparent, and here this morning on behalf of the Parent Collaborative from Los Angeles Unified. We do not have an official position on the bill, but I would like to point out that being competitive and being successful are two very, very different things. LEAs traditionally routinely make assurances under their consolidated applications and, again, routinely fall short of those assurances to the federal government, to say nothing of the assurances that they make to the state. What are we going to do to ensure that LEAs involve parents in plans, in monitoring, and in evaluation? Please ensure that anything that you do here includes parents at the LEA level and at the SEA level. Thank you.
Other witnesses in support? Witnesses in opposition?
Good morning. Martha Zaragoza-Diaz, representing the Californians Together Coalition. Our reasons for oppose unless amended, I've been stating since August. Essentially, it's because the resources, the funding, the activities are not targeted to student subgroups who are not meeting their accountability targets. These would include English learners, your special ed kids. Our other concern is the fact that we have an opportunity when looking at reauthorizing the pupil assessment system. Again, we're not taking a look at the issue of valid and reliable assessments for English learners or accommodations for English learners. Again, we're missing an opportunity to do that. And my last one has to do with the fact that this bill creates a new commission that I don't really understand why that's being done when right now there is an existing commission, the Curriculum Commission, who has been given the authority to revise academic content standards and also to approve instructional materials. Why are we creating a new commission to do this? And so those are my concerns. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other witnesses against? Seeing none, we'll bring it back to the dais here. Questions? Senator
Senator Romero, can you answer the question about why a new commission was created?
Bring witnesses up. And one other area, if I can add as well, too, that I didn't mention in my opening statement is that changes were also included. An amendment was taken in the Assembly to chapter out a problem with SB X52, the Semidian bill, which was approved by both houses and is on the governor's desk. So I wanted to acknowledge that.
Catherine Gaither, Governor's Office of Education. The new commission was included because the current commission does not actually have the authority to develop academic standards, and so there was a desire to have a public process, and so a commission was created with representatives from the legislature as well as from the governor to work together to create a new recommended set of standards, including the Common Core, that's being developed by the National Consortium, the NGA and the Chief Council of State School Officers, as well as most of the 50 states have been participating in that effort, and it is one of the requirements of Race to the Top. So the new commission's task is to look at the Common Core and then develop standards in addition to the Common Core that will ensure that California's standards maintain their existing rigor. And it's being done through a public process, and then it will go before the state board for a vote.
Thank you.
Any other questions, Senator Liu?
No, just one other thing here. It defines a mentor school as a school that existed from program improvement status under the federal NCLD or has increased in API ranking by 2 or more deciles over the last 5 years. I'd hate to have a ranking of 3 to be a mentor for schools in decile 1. That won't happen, right? We're not talking about that.
We actually wanted it to be broader and to have schools that were actually API 800 or higher.
Right.
But like everything else, it was negotiated, and that's what was placed. It wasn't necessarily where we were on that issue.
I think the thought for those who added to that provision was that if a school had managed to raise itself from a very low level to a higher level, that it had the experience that it could share with a similarly situated
I just
school.
think the bar is pretty low. That's
Okay. Senator Weiland.
There are lots of very good things in this bill. Obviously, these things have been changed, but we do a lot to get good science educators in school. That hasn't been talked about a lot. The struggling students and struggling schools we need to help. We also need to make sure that the students who have the ability to excel in those subjects get help. And just to mention one of a dozen things as I've been going through here that are good. That's a good thing we've been trying to do ever since I was on the Education Committee. This is tremendous. These are the kids who are going to major in sciences and engineering and create the new industries in this state. That's just one thing. You can go on and on and on and on through here, and all these things, there are many, 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 are great improvements. And I just point out that this committee, I was very concerned about the committee initially because I thought we had the state board and the commission worked well. But I do notice that their instructions are very, very specific. It's language arts and math. It's to be internationally benchmarked. It's to be coordinated with the national consortium. And that national consortium is going to have the same goals that we all have. So I think this moves the ball forward a lot. And to go back to the other thing, you know, a long, long, long time ago, I worked for the city of New York on the education budget. And in all those intervening years, we have allowed education for a lot of struggling kids to just go nowhere. Just go nowhere. I mean, it is just morally abhorrent not to do something about that, as well as practically important. And you've heard me talk about English language learners. That's a quarter of our kids. I mean, in a district like LA, and in my area, people think, oh, Northern San Diego County, this totally well-to-do area. Well, I'll tell you, in Escondido and San Marcos and Vista, I probably have a majority of those school kids who are children of color, mostly Latino, and probably 3/4 of them enter school not speaking English. Unless we fix that, this demographic bubble is never going to bring California where we want it to be. We need these kids to be educated, to be good citizens, to be able to do all the things we'd like them to do. I move the bill.
All right. We had a motion. Other questions? Senator Simitian.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Romero, two things. I heard you in a follow-up comment just a minute ago, I want to make sure I got it right, indicate that the amendments taken to the bill do address the chaptering out issues with respect to SB 2 in the fifth extraordinary session, yes?
That is correct.
Thank you. I appreciate the commitment before, and I appreciate your commitment to following up on the commitment. I would like to ask for a second if you or one of the witnesses who spoke, I think from Ed Voice, could speak to the issue of standards with less specificity. What I'm trying to do is take a big step back and get my arms around what this debate is really about. As I look at the staff analysis and that includes the race to the top selection criteria, and the standards and assessment is 70 points, and there's reference under Table 1B1, Part 1 and 2. This is again from the Assembly version, which I got earlier for obvious reasons. Developing and adopting common standards, participating in consortium developing high quality standards, and then adopting standards. Okay, so just sort of big picture what's going on here. The administration is trying to achieve what by pushing this issue to the fore, and then what is it we've got in place that we have to somehow change in order to address the administration's goals through Race to the Top, and then how does that create some problems? Because I know it's been a source of a lot of buzz, but I for one, have been working, frankly, to get my arms around just sort of conceptually what this is about. Anybody?
Matt, Mr. Chairman,
please.
Bill Lucia from Ed Voice. The table that's referred to is in an Appendix C of the regulations for the Race to the Top guidelines, and there's an applicability of 70 points to a criteria of standards and assessment. And one of the requirements, in participating and being competitive, is that at least 85% of the standards that are English language arts and mathematics standards are to be one and the same with the Common Core. And the concern that has been raised by folks is stepping before talking about concerns, I believe from the Washington lens, the national level lens, the concern has been that there have been states that gamed the system after 2002 January, when No Child Left Behind was signed and required each state to have assessments. That we were at an era at that point where not all of the 50 states even had individual pupil assessments to assess progress with Title I schools. And there were just grade span assessments, and even at that point and the subsequent years shortly after the signing of NCLB, there were wide discrepancies on state exams in terms of reports of percent proficient by grade level and what was appearing on NAEP and the relative ranking of states on NAEP.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, and I appreciate this is helpful, but we're into the weeds a little bit more than I want to be. I want to pull you back and say, okay, put assessment aside for a minute. We've got some standards out there. They're part of the Common Core. Who promulgated those? Where'd they come from?
The Common Core have not yet been promulgated. There's an effort underway, a consortium between the National Governors Association and the Chief State School Officers Association.
Okay. So as I understood what you said a minute ago, and please correct me if I've got it wrong, we've got some yet-to-be-developed Common Core that the consortium is developing, and the feds want to make sure that at least 85% of our standards align with that Common Core. Is that right?
Yes, either that consortia or another consortia in this another unnamed but recognized by the U.S. Department of Education. So one way or another, what the feds want is a more common metric of looking at academic goals by grade levels, so which they can compare progress and achievement toward academic standards.
And one of the concerns that has popped up, and again, just feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on this one, is that we might be obliged to, quote, lower our standards.
That's correct.
Okay. And clearly that's not something that the authors would want us to do. First of all, do we think that's a legitimate concern, that there would be a set of core standards? We'd be told we want everybody playing from the same set of rules, so you have to be in sync on 85%, and now all of a sudden we're obliged to adopt standards that we don't think are as good as somebody else's standards.
Yes, that's a valid concern. There are other states, for example, when the jargon is used of internationally benchmarked and post-secondary education eligible, California has a higher standard in mathematics than other states do. And so in terms of what to be prepared to do college-ready work, as an example. And specifically on the area of mathematics, that's an area where the preliminary work has been done, and there appears to be
done here in California.
No, done on the consortia.
Thank you.
With drafts circulating where there have already been concerns raised in the area of mathematics.
And so what, if anything, can we do, are we doing, and doing through this bill to make sure that by agreeing to Common Core standards, we are not actually reducing the rigor of California's standards?
Well, specifically what's being done in the bill is the opportunity for a public process so that all Californians with Bagley-Keene meeting notification requirements have an opportunity in broad daylight to see what gets done in the deliberation process and the final recommendations that this commission would have to the board. The board, under this bill, the State Board of Education, would only have an opportunity to approve or disapprove the recommendations of the Standards Commission, and the State Board of Education could, in fact, disapprove those standards if they determined that they weren't appropriate for the state of California. But this compromise that you see before you today is different from other approaches that had been proposed that had actually allowed the entire process to be done without any public input whatsoever, and to have a single individual have the sole authority to recommend the changes to the current standards to incorporate the Common Core and submit those to the board for an up or down vote.
As a practical, and I think thank you, that's helpful. As a practical matter, are we seriously talking about a case where, having gone through this process, someone's going to be standing before the State Board of Education, as I understand it, and saying, I'm sorry, folks, but I have to recommend that we reduce the rigor of California standards because we're obliged under federal law to conform to the core standards?
As a practical matter, I think because of the sensitivity of this, the public scrutiny that will take place, and the fact that that even required among the appointees are public classroom teachers, and I personally would assume that since we're talking about English language arts and math, we don't have social studies, no disrespect to social studies or other core subject matter areas, but that the pro tem and the speaker and the governor would be appointing subject matter experts as well as teachers that are hopefully very well bought into the fact that California has world-class standards now. They've been graded highly by folks on the right, like the Fordham Foundation, and folks on the center left, like AFT, have ranked California standards at the top. There are other states actually that are watching what happens in California and what you do here today, and what a standards commission would do. And there has been some talk that if the National Governors Association and the Chief State School Officers Association work does not meet muster, that other states that have higher standards may come together and court California into a different consortia that would also be allowable, and if approved by Secretary Duncan, to have California work with those other states.
So we could have the Cool Kids Club, and then that would be okay. That'd be good. Don't we want to be in the Cool Kids Club?
I think what Ed Voice believes where we are today is improved in the sense that this is not going to be done behind closed doors. It's going to be in public. That all the stakeholders, parents, teachers, the business community, school leaders, and everyone else that was involved 12 years ago, all through today, that have vested interest, will be involved in this. And certainly the legislature has an interest on a policy basis and a fiduciary one, because changing significantly from where we are today, in a subsequent committee later this afternoon, you'll hear that it could entail substantial costs in the numbers of big numbers to try and shift the course. And so it would, just from a fiduciary standpoint alone, it would be smart for California to try and maintain as close to what we have in terms of rigor and substance in the standards, to minimize the changes in terms of instructional materials and staff development and so on and so forth.
Let me try and do a cliff notes on what I think you just told me and make sure I've got it right. You believe that we are less likely to get to that bad place that I'm worried about, where somebody's standing in front of the board saying we have to reduce the quality of our standards or lower our expectations, because there will now be a public process that will inform that exercise, and that even if, having gotten all the best input available through that public exercise, we ended up in a bad place, that other similarly situated states might have the potential to come together to form a different core, a third consensus that would then have bona fide standing. So do I get that right?
Yes, with a caveat that another alternative may be for a consensus to build in California, to recognize that we are ill-informed about saying that we have improved our education system solely by having higher standards. And if the will of Californians, right or wrong, from depending on which lens you look at it, is to have a different set of standards that some may perceive are lower, then it was done in broad daylight, and that would be acceptable to Californians broadly, and in making these decisions, including the State Board of Education ultimately, then that would be the appropriate modifications to be made.
Are you hinting that perhaps different standards might be not only okay but desirable if, for example, we did a better job on assessment?
I think that the kinds of changes that are being looked at are not so much what happens vis-a-vis assessment, but in terms of breadth and depth of standards, and as well as alignment of standards in articulating among grade levels. For example, there's a question of whether to look at the standards framework and apparatus as one of a horizontal one that looks at the end of grade proficiency levels, or whether it's a vertical articulated scale of academic knowledge and rigor throughout the grades, for example.
Last question to anyone who wants to respond on this topic on standards. We often just sort of colloquially, shorthand, talk about higher standards, lower standards. It seems to me that just sort of seat the pants with no expertise. My observation would be there are some standards where higher and lower is probably a fair way to characterize, but in some cases the standards are just different. That it's a much more subjective, value-driven notion about what we want kids to know and when we want them to know it. How does that play in? I mean, to what extent is this about higher and lower, and to what extent is this about just, different folks have different points of view or sets of values about what the standards ought to be?
I believe it's both. In fact, there are people there are some that would say that this line of questioning is the biggest part of this whole apparatus, and that that President Obama and Arne Duncan would not have been able to achieve this without the cooperation of the governors and the chief state school officers in the states themselves, because this debate is a national debate. In getting into the weeds for a second, it also matters in some people's minds in looking at the measurement towards standards, and whether certain, it can be subjective and even analytical approaches to measurement in looking at growth, and whether the design of the standards in a horizontal or vertical way provides a better opportunity for certain types of growth models, for example. So again, not necessarily the rigor of academic content at any given grade level, but then how ultimately are you going to measure that? So there are those in this debate that are focused on that component exclusively. There are in California, relative to other states, there are some clear-cut issues, though, as I mentioned, in the area of when do you expect kids to read? At what point do you say that a student is college ready? What level of mathematical competency do they need to have to be successful as a citizen? And so unfortunately, what precipitated where we are today in the strong pressure at the national level to do this is there were several Midwest and Southern states that took advantage of the fact that, okay, if we don't want to have a bunch of schools and AYP and program improvement and all that, then we'll just make our cut scores lower. And then we don't have to worry about that. We'll take the money and nothing has to change. And I think to their credit, Secretary Duncan and his team have said that they're taking the baton further down the road from where things were in the architecture of the SEA in the last reauthorization, and they're intending to continue to pursue excellence for all kids and not making excuse for subgroups or poverty or any other criteria, and recognizing that we need to be competitive among our states, but also competitive internationally as well.
But that does pose some challenges for folks who didn't game the system and who feel like they did a good and rigorous job first time out.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity to delve a little into that.
Thank you. Senator Weiland, you had a quick comment on the comments?
Yeah, just briefly on standards. If you actually read the standards, they are very, very, very high. And the reality is we don't, in fact, test that everyone meets those standards. We have a norm reference test. Other states, as Mr. Lucia pointed out, and you can see it in the NAEP, all the NAEP scores, the huge divergence, didn't do any of this. I submit that this is going to make really, really, really high standards. The kids who really meet these standards are the kids who are taking SAT 2s, who are taking the AP exams. Those standards are, in some cases, are standards that a lot of college graduates couldn't meet. So I don't think we need to worry about these standards. I really don't. I think if we just get standards that we get more kids to meet and have an assessment that actually makes sure that they meet those standards, really will have achieved a lot. We really will. One just quick example is in all reading comprehension is in English, where it should not be, because most of it in high school is literature. And one of those standards says that every single high school graduate, but compare this, if you've ever taken it, to high school exit exam. I mean, it's just absurd. It says that every high school graduate should be able to read an editorial, understand the editorial, cite the evidence given, cite the point of view of the author, determine whether or not the evidence given in the editorial supports the opinion of the author. To do that coherently, cogently, and write that, I submit, is something a lot of college graduates would struggle with. But that's in our standards, because they're world-class standards. So I think our challenge is going to be not so much the standards, but just have an assessment system so more kids can begin to meet them.
Thank you, Senator. Any other questions, comments? Seeing none, we do have a motion, and would you please close?
Thank you so much, members, for this conversation. I wanted to acknowledge, although he has left the room, the President of the Senate, Senator Steinberg. I want to thank him profusely for his belief, his passion, his commitment in fighting for this reform in California. And I also want to take an opportunity to thank, in particular, his staff, Susanna Cooper, who I think also has just left the room as well. Also, of course, in the Assembly, I'd like to give special thanks to the Speaker of the House, Karen Bass, and, of course, to the Chief Education Consultant, Rick Simpson, as well. I know that these were
Who's standing behind you still? He is in the room.
And he is in the room. Terrific. These were long, intense negotiations. There were passions. There were tempers, strong debates. But at the end of the day, we have an opportunity to run a lap, to cross that finish line, and today is the final lap in getting this forward to the governor's desk. With that, I respectfully ask for an aye vote.
All right. We have a motion. Please call the roll.
Romero?
Aye.
Romero, aye. Huff?
Aye.
Huff, aye. Alquist? Hancock? Lou? Lou, aye. Maldonado? Padilla? Padilla, aye. Semidian? Semidian, aye. Wyland? Wyland, aye. 6-0.
Okay, 6-0. The bill is out. And before we adjourn the meeting, I would like to acknowledge and welcome our new Chief Education Consultant, Danny Alvarez. Welcome, Danny. It only gets better from here.
Coming from budget committee, so.
Oh, coming from budget. You may like this, you know. Anyway, there being no further business before us, this meeting's adjourned.